Hi, I'm Will Becton.
And I'm Amber Becton.
The feeling of deja vu is actually a little seizure.
I did read that recently. We're very happy to bring you episode 5 of Jett Road Studios Presents, where each episode is a pilot for a different show.
That's right. Today, we present History Around You, hosted by Krysta Gonzales. The pilot episode is an account of the San Elizario Salt War, which was a community-led insurrection that took place in West Texas in the late 1800s.
Krysta Gonzales is an actor and writer based in Los Angeles. Krysta is a voiceover artist in Elemental and Inside Out 2. She's also a company member of Dan Foote and Company, which creates theater pieces, podcasts, and community gatherings that foster dialogue around hunger, race, and the gun debate. She is originally from Texas, and Krysta traveled to the El Paso area to interview her mother and grandmother for the pilot.
So you and Krysta met while working on a commercial together, right?
We did. There's an interesting thing being a costumer for commercials. There's a real shorthand when you're dealing with actors.
Mm-hmm.
Krysta had a warmth. I told her what we were doing, and she is an incredible writer.
Yeah, it's a really cool idea. Basically, it's family stories about history that if you hadn't heard that story, you wouldn't know about it. And it's interesting because this episode comes out on January 6th and is about an insurrection, but that's just, a coincidence.
It's about an insurrection that makes sense, right?
Yes.
Like, I think that's the thing.
Yeah. Krysta's been amazing to work with, and we're proud to share this story with you.
Jett Road Studios presents
History Around You.
You're listening to History Around You with me, Krysta Gonzales. I'm an actor, writer, and now a podcaster based in Los Angeles. All right, before we dive in, I want to stress that I'm not a historian. I'm a storyteller, originally from Texas. And Texans are known for telling tall tales from time to time. So if my facts aren't perfectly straight or I embellish a little bit, that's just how it goes sometimes, darling. Especially when we talk about the past. I've been hearing pretty often that these are historic times. I'd argue that times have always been historic. Ordinary people that aren't necessarily famous or part of the collective consciousness lived through extraordinary situations. If you're lucky, you grow up hearing stories about your family and those who came before you. And often they're the same stories over and over, but sometimes you get hit with a zinger. A detail or something that really puts history and your predecessors into perspective for you. And that got me thinking, while some of our elders are still here, why not take advantage? I was fortunate to grow up with a family who frequently shared stories about where and who we come from. My grandmother, my mom, my tias and tios all repeated the same refrain with pride. Mija, you're a Gonzales and a Muñoz. Where I'm from, the lower valley of El Paso, Texas, that means something. When folks ask me where I'm from, it's an interesting conversation. They're not asking about my geographic history. They're asking about my ethnicity. So I usually say, I'm Black American and Mexican American. Without fail, they then ask, oh, where in Mexico? And I say, Texas. Texas used to be a part of Mexico. It was officially annexed to the Union in 1848. Under the Treaty of Hidalgo after the Mexican-American War, which ended with the U.S. cutting a check to Mexico and then owning Texas. Suddenly, a bunch of Mexicans became American. Honestly, that's true for a lot of families in El Paso and throughout the state. It's definitely true for me and my family.
My name is Rachel Gonzales.
That's my mom.
My name is Krysta Gonzales.
And that's my grandma. On a recent visit with them, we drove by one of the missions, and my mother was reminding me about our ancestors in San Elizario, which is about 20 miles southeast of downtown El Paso. I said something to the effect of, man, Mommy, we have deep roots here, huh? And take no shit. She said, did I ever tell you about the time we ran a gringo out of town? And that was a record scratch moment for me. So I asked her to say more, and that's when she told me about the San Elizario Salt War, a bloody conflict where a wealthy white man from Virginia tried to stake a claim on salt flats that had been public property when Texas was under Spanish rule. To begin, we go back to the later half of the 1800s. Now, when we talk about the Wild West, this is it. The Salt Flats lay at the base of the Guadalupe Mountains in West Texas, about 100 miles east of El Paso. For generations, people would help themselves to the salt available without having to pay. It was a natural resource that communities utilized and respected. Salt was important back then because it was used to preserve meat. No refrigerators in the 1800s. And it was also used for extracting silver. These uses, among others, made it valuable and therefore a type of currency.
The salt flat was so important to not just us, but a very large area.
Mm-hmm.
The Native Americans had been using it for thousands of years. Then, the Mexicans and Spanish, and nobody charged for it.
All right, I think we're about ready. Without further ado, here's my mom and grandma's account of the San Elizario Salt War. Our conversation took place in Socorro, Texas, which is about 10 minutes away from San Elizario. Who told you about the San Elizario Salt War? Who did you hear it from?
My great-grandmother Mary, my mom's grandmother.
Okay.
She's sitting in her wheelchair, and I'm sitting on the floor looking up at her.
Mm-hmm.
She was speaking Spanish. So she was saying once there was this beef about the salt, and people used to go to the salt flat to get salt for free. You'd go cut out a couple of blocks, and then you come back. It lasts, months, if not a year. Then you go back. You take a wagon.
Right. It was like 100 miles or something.
Or sometimes the men would gather together and go get it,
Mm-hmm.
and then bring it for the whole town.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then a white man, she didn't say his name,
Mm-hmm.
wanted to own it and charge people for it. And the people all around us, not just us, said no. And he did it anyway.
The key players in this saga are the community-based insurgency of San Elizario, led by Lino Granillo, Francisco Varela, and my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Sisto Salcido, who was a farmer. This group is often characterized in history books and historical periodicals as a howling mob. We also have Charles Howard, the gringo my mother was talking about. There's more historical documentation about him than about my great-great-great-great-grandfather, the farmer, which isn't surprising. Howard was a lawyer and a Virginian who came to El Paso by way of Austin and became a judge when he came to Texas. He's also described as an arrogant individual, and once he arrived in West Texas, he tried to stake a claim on the Salt Flats. And finally, the Texas Rangers are also a major part of this story. They patrolled the old frontier of Texas, and Howard called upon them for protection when the conflict with the San Elizario community began to escalate. In Spanish, they were referred to as Diablos Tejanos, which translates to Texan devils.
They just would ignore us completely until they wanted something. And then they would just take it. They wouldn't pay for it. They wouldn't
cut a deal. Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that went on a lot.
At this time, it was common land. Nobody owned it. But after Texas was annexed to the Union, the state allowed folks to claim rights to the land. Shocker. Wouldn't you know it, but 3 gringos planned to file together. Albert J. Fountain, Luis Gardis, and Charles Howard. However, Charles Howard double-crossed his partners and filed on his own. The Mexicans in the middle of this were definitely not having it, so they partnered with Gardis to oppose Howard. In 1877, locals tried to collect salt as they had done many times before, and Howard tried to have them arrested. However, he ended up being apprehended himself by the community.
He was charging people, but people would still go and get it. So he brought in gunfighters first. And then somebody got killed and he got busted. But because he had connections, he got out.
He was guarded for 3 days by several hundred men, led by Francisco Varela, Lino Granillo, and Sisto Salcido. The group debated whether or not to kill Howard, but after Gardis intervened, Howard agreed to leave and back out of trying to own the land. So he was released. He fled to New Mexico, but then he said, you know what? On second thought. And instead of keeping his promise and minding his business, he went back to Texas and killed Gardis at the Mercantile in El Paso. And he was never prosecuted for this murder. Another group of Mexicans tried to get some salt again, and he went to stop them, this time with the support and protection of the Texas Rangers. He showed up in San Elizario with about 20 Rangers, but a mob of 500 angry townspeople were waiting for him and held both him and the Rangers captive for about 3 or 4 days.
They went and got him, and then the white people called in the Rangers to negotiate his release back to custody in El Paso. But the people of San Elizario said, no, he murdered someone. He has to stand trial here. He murdered someone from here.
Mm-hmm.
The Rangers came. The people said no. And Sisto was one of the men who guarded him.
Howard.
He was one of the ones guarding him so that the Rangers couldn't get to him.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know who fired the first shot, but there was a shootout and several Rangers got hurt or killed. And then they holed up in the church.
Howard, along with the entourage of Rangers, surrendered, but he and those closest to him in the ordeal were executed by firing squad. The rest of the Rangers were disarmed and run off, lucky to stay alive. Immediately after the altercation, looting and violence erupted in the community, and the Buffalo Soldiers, regiments composed exclusively of Black Americans, were sent down to restore order.
What happened in the aftermath of the Salt War? How did the U.S. government respond?
Grandma Mary did tell me this too. They weren't made a stop on the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
They took away Fort Bliss, and they took the county seat. So economically, they really stuck it to
The people of San Elizario.
Yeah.
So there was supposed to be a railroad stop here, but it went into El Paso proper instead and bypassed San Eli.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, it was definitely an economic punishment.
Yeah.
Do you know how the community responded? Like, you mentioned that much of the community is farmers. So was it just, okay, we're going to lean into farming and taking care of ourselves, or?
Yeah, they had been established already for several hundred years. Actually, the area has been settled by different native tribes for a long time. But the European settlement and then the Mestizo peoples had been there for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
So they may have lost commercially, but they were still a farming community. In fact, when the Depression hit and the Dust Bowl destroyed the plains,
Mm-hmm.
they were sitting pretty. And they also had the river.
Oh, right. All the canals and stuff. They had built that system.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was already in place. So during the Depression, the people of San Elizario and Fabens and Clinton, all these other little communities did okay. They knew how to grow stuff in drought conditions because it's desert here. And they knew how to survive because they were always poor.
Mm-hmm.
They never had the opportunities that the rest of the country or even the state had. So it isolated them and they became fairly insulated, but they already knew what hardship was. And so they knew how to make do with whatever they could find. And they helped each other. They still had the very Native American feeling and of a village taking care of each other.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it was pretty chaotic afterwards.
Yeah, they shot up the church because the Rangers were hiding in there.
Mm.
I asked my grandmother about the wall in the church, listing names of some of the original peoples and families. And I asked her, who are we related to? And she said, everybody by blood or marriage.
Mm.
That's basically just one big, huge family that took care of each other during hard times, including the Salt War and the aftermath.
Right.
I think I even saw it in history books growing up.
Oh.
And I remember seeing that name, Sisto. Like, hey, I know him. Are we related?
We're related. Everybody's related.
My grandmother is experiencing dementia, so trying to preserve the stories she's shared has become incredibly important to me. In the end, the salt flats were claimed and the people did have to pay for the salt. But at least we went down swinging.
How does it feel to retell this story?
Awesome, because
It's history.
yeah, it's
history.
to pass down stories within the community and family is important to us. There's so much that's already been lost. So this is not going to get lost, and that's awesome.
Yeah.
I'd made an off-the-cuff remark about our family's roots to our home and about our fighting spirit.
But to hear about it in action, to know our descent actually made headlines almost 150 years ago, stopped me in my tracks.
What do you think that this story says about us as Gonzaleses and Muñozes and as Tejanos, Chicanos, Mexicans?
Well, one, we stick together.
Mm-hmm.
Two, you can't push us around. You think you can, but you can't.
No, cannot.
The way they tried to stick it to us with the economic punishments,
Mm-hmm.
I see it. There's not a lot of commercial buildings like banks
Mm-hmm.
or even a hospital or lawyers or
Mhm.
doctors, which you would find in a city. There wasn't a lot of that at all. We had like a local clinic.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, they built a small hospital. But a lot of the things that you take for granted in a city didn't come to us. While the rest of the country basically is in the 20th century, ours was still in the 19th. It was a big thing for us to have done because we're such a small, basically it was a village.
Yeah.
Now it's a bigger town, but it wasn't even really, I would consider a whole town. Mostly farmers and people involved with the church and things like that.
I feel a deep reverence for my family's survival. And I also feel frustration and anger at the scenarios and systems we've had to survive for generations, even now. And I'm left wondering still about the ramifications of who gets to tell the stories that withstand time. I never heard this story when I was in school. I learned it by chance. Maybe the next time an elder from your family or community hits you with a story you've heard 1,000,000 times before, dig a little deeper. See what details may open the door to a bit of time travel. I mean, who doesn't love to hear, "Tell me more," right? What history lives in those around you?
Thank you both so much.
Pleasure. Yeah.
In 3, 2, 1, say bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to my family's account of the San Elizario Salt War in this episode of History Around You. This episode is dedicated in loving memory of my Auntie Gorgeous, more formally known as Jessica Marie Gonzales Solomon. She was a lover of history and listening to the stories of our family's place in it.
That was History Around You. Such an amazing story.
Yeah, I went to school in Texas and, I've been in that area a bit. And it was very cool that she actually was able to go down there and interview her mom and grandma.
Oh, I loved hearing her grandmother's story. I loved her grandmother's interjections because you can just feel the feeling of it. Like, no, you cannot take advantage of us. I loved it.
Yeah, and it's crazy. Like, it occurred to me that if a border wall was built at that time, then Krysta's family would have been on the U.S. side of it. They would have been like... and
as
then,
Mexicans.
Yeah, didn't migrate. There's that expression about, what is it, the winter writes history? What's the...
History is written by the victors.
That's a Churchill quote, right?
It is, and I think that we're dealing with a lot of that right now. It's not surprising that you don't know more of these stories.
Yeah, and the punitive measures against the town was pretty nuts.
I loved how Krysta's mom said, but we knew how to live because we had always been poor. We knew how to survive.
Yeah, I really love what this show has to say. Hopefully we'll be able to make more of these episodes and Krysta can shed light on other family stories.
I would love that. Thank you so much for listening to Jett Road Studios Presents. Please rate and review the show on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It really does help. You can also find us on Instagram and YouTube.
Yes, thank you for Krysta Gonzales for sharing your story with us and being such an amazing collaborator.
And a very big thank you as well to Krysta's mother, Rachel Gonzales, and Christina Gonzales, her grandmother. I really loved hearing her grandmother's voice, both literally and figuratively.
Thanks for listening.
See you soon.
Jett Road Studios, where it's always pilot season.